Hello, learners, and welcome to the 20th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th Century Anglophone Women's Novel. I have been discussing Nightwood by Djuna Barnes. I have been reading a lot from the opening pages and trying to provide you with a sense of what it feels like to encounter the words of this novel. That encounter, the sensation, the reactions, and the meanings of those words is actually an important part of the experience of studying Nightwood, because whatever interpretation we can undertake of this novel can only emerge from a reckoning with those very immediate reactions to the words of the novel. As I mentioned, it doesn't have much by way of plot, but it does have a lot, almost too much, by way of modes of perception. So how we perceive that description of the different modes of perception is crucial. So before we identify any theme or decide on an approach to understanding the significance of the theme, it's important to first get a sense of what the novel is. It is a very unique and unprecedented and one-of-a-kind object. So with that intention, I've been trying to provide a sense of what happens and what it feels like to experience these words. So continuing with that, in the second chapter, which introduces Robin Vogt, we encounter this conversation, a somewhat strange conversation between Felix and the doctor. The doctor declares that he finds it puzzling that whenever he hears music, he thinks that he's a bride. To which Felix gives this response and possible explanation that it must be neurasthenia. Now, neurasthenia is a medical condition. It's an outdated term. It was dropped from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the clinical manual of the US Medical Association in 1980. But it described a very real, very distressing and disabling set of conditions. The symptoms included chronic fatigue, localized pain, headaches, migraines, stress, dizziness, etc., but without any obvious cause. And it was understood that these symptoms were caused by the myriad stresses of simply living in modern industrial Europe and North America. So it was seen in its early days as simply a symptom of existing in modernity. That said, this theoretical understanding was not very widespread, and it existed as a medicalized condition. Neurasthenia, therefore, was a medical condition, and the very fact that Felix provides this as the first thought in response to the doctor's question that he might be a bride suggests that the narrator takes a somewhat parodic attitude towards both medical conditions as well as the conditions of modern life which produce these stressful conditions. So obviously the fact that the doctor thinks he's a bride when he hears music is a symptom of existing in modernity. Modernity with its restrictions on the kinds of gender roles and the kinds of sexual orientations that people born with certain bodies were allowed. And it is clear that for the doctor, and given the body he is born with, being a bride is not one of the available or a sustainable alternative. Nonetheless, he is triggered into feeling that it is appropriate in certain conditions, that is, when he hears music. This is a symptom of modernity. It is also a resistance to the pressures of modernity. However, instead of identifying it as such, Felix simply comes up with a term which is neurasthenia. It might be comedic, but it is also actually quite critical, because neurasthenia was also understood as a resistance, a signal that was being sent by the tissues and the muscles and cells of the body, a sign of resistance to the pressures of society, to the kinds of ways in which human bodies were being manipulated and controlled by the spaces and the technologies of modern industrialized Europe. That said, that is not an accurate answer, and there is some humor intended. But the joke isn't over yet, and because in response, the doctor gives another very witty and funny response. The doctor says, I'm not neurasthenic. I haven't that much respect for people. The basis, by the way, of all neurasthenia, impatience, is what Felix says. So there are two things happening. First, the doctor clarifies that it is not neurasthenia, even though it might look like it. So while Felix is intelligent enough and witty enough to come up with this possible explanation, the doctor says that no, it's not neurasthenia. And the reason that the doctor gives for why his condition is not neurasthenia is also another critical response to modern life. And what is that exactly? The doctor says that he couldn't possibly be neurasthenic, that is, he couldn't possibly feel the stresses of existing in modern industrial Europe because he doesn't have that much respect for people. And that response should give us pause and should ask us to think about what is this? What does the doctor mean by having respect for people? And why would having respect for other people cause neurasthenia? So, this is an extremely gendered comment, and this refers to how some people, not everyone, are trained to and are expected to have respect for others, and specifically not just respect for others in the abstract, but respect for what others expect given the kind of body one is born into. So, looking back to the previous statement that the doctor sometimes gets the idea that he's a bride, that idea, the suspicion or the thought, comes from the doctor not having much respect for other people. At least temporarily, when the doctor listens to music, he's able to not have too much respect and is able to freely imagine an identity and a future and a role for himself, irrespective of what other people would expect from him. So, because the doctor does not have that much respect, he couldn't possibly have neurasthenia. And neurasthenia, again, we are given a definition of neurasthenia, which is itself very gendered. So the restrictions on gender, binary oppositions, heteronormative ideas of sexual orientation, these are defining features of modernity. And here the doctor identifies these features as being the cause of these unknown stresses or apparently mysterious pains, stresses, chronic fatigue, etc. The pressure to make oneself appear normal, even though the very definition of what normal is very arbitrary and representative of a very narrow slice of humanity. So, everyone feeling the pressure to be identified as normal by others. And this pressure produces a great deal of stress. People perform normalcy. And this performance of normalcy produces symptoms like chronic fatigue, headache, dizziness, etc. So, a very loaded statement and an extremely critical statement, a statement that anticipates much of the reflection, the explosion into multiple forms of these categories of identity, which would take place in the early 21st century. So, an extremely prescient novel, Djuna Barnes' Nightwood. Now, the joke continues, however, and once the doctor says that he cannot be neurasthenic because he doesn't respect other people, Felix immediately counters, so if not neurasthenia, it must be impatience. And so, wildly shuttling between medical terms and this kind of an impressionistic opinion, the lack of patience does not qualify as a medical condition, yet Felix immediately offers this as an explanation. And the joke concludes when the doctor agrees with this explanation. And the doctor says, yeah, that must be true, effectively, because the Irish, and here I'm quoting, the Irish are impatient for eternity, they lie to hurry it up, and they maintain their balance by the dexterity of God, and the Father. So, after this elaborate joke, Robin Vogt arrives on the scene of the novel. She has fainted in one of the upper rooms of the same establishment where Felix and the doctor are having a drink. One of the staff in the establishment calls the doctor because someone has fainted and the doctor seems like he would be able to help. After this, the two go up and we get a description of Robin Vogt. which is an extremely important one because several themes are introduced, several perceptual modes are introduced. The narrator gives us the medium and the mode through which to perceive these characters. So here is how the narrator introduces Robin Wood. On a bed surrounded by a confusion of potted plants, exotic palms, and cut flowers, faintly oversung by the notes of unseen birds, which seem to have been forgotten, left without the usual silencing cover, which, like the cloaks on funeral urns, are cast over their cages at night by good housewives, half flung off the support of cushions from which, in a moment of threatened consciousness, she had turned her head, lay the young woman, heavy and dishevelled. Her legs, in white flannel trousers, were spread as in a dance, the thick lacquered pumps looking too lively for the arrested step. Her hands, long and beautiful, lay on either side of her face. And this description continues. I will read it and then offer some comments. The perfume that her body exhaled was of the quality of that earth, flesh, fungi, which smells of captured dampness, and yet is so dry, overcast with the odor of oil on amber, which is an inner malady of the sea, making her seem as if she had invaded a sleep incautious and entire. Her flesh was the texture of plant life, and beneath it one sensed a frame, broad, porous, and sleep-worn, as if sleep were a decay, fishing her beneath the visible surface. About her head there was an effulgence as of phosphorus glowing about the circumference of a body of water, as if her life lay through her in ungainly luminous deteriorations, the troubling structure of the born somnambule who lives in two worlds, meat of child and desperado. So, a long description, but several key features which we must pay attention to and carry forward. So, the first is that of the state of lack of agency. So, the fact that there is this woman who's lying unconscious and there are two other characters who are male who come upon her, there is a clear dynamic of an unequal separation of power. The woman who's unconscious and lying disheveled, heavy, and prone, every feature of her body in that posture is slack. There is very little agency, or apparently very little agency, in this posture. And in this sense, seen from a human perspective, it appears that this figure is weak and is at the mercy of others. That is the first impression we get from the first long paragraph. But then something else happens. And also, at the end of this paragraph, we are told that her hands were long and beautiful, and they lay on either side of her face. So, in some ways, this is replicating some of the aesthetics and the gender dynamics of 19th century English poetry, in which women were often described as beautiful, but this beauty also came hand in hand with a lack of agency. Women were not supposed to, or at least the women in these writings were often not supposed to be active agents. They were beautiful creatures, but often had to be given agency or were acted upon or acted through other powerful male characters. The first impression we get, this is going to be that kind of a description. However, in the very next paragraph, something new is introduced. And I'm going to say that it is not simply feminine agency or female empowerment, but rather it is a sort of human empowerment through the perception of life within human bodies as being an extension of the kinds of agencies that are circulating in the natural world. And specifically speaking, the kinds of agencies that are circulating through the world of plants, through the world of nature. Those agencies, this narrator is asking us to believe, are also the same kinds of agencies and energies which animate the lives and bodies of human beings. But it takes a very unique and important shift in our mode of perception to be able to see that the same forms of energy which animate plants also animate human bodies. And once we are able to manage that shift in our perspective, it also realigns our understanding of what counts as agency, what counts as power, and what counts as the lack of agency, or what counts as being the subject or being the object of power. And in this case, the narrator will enable us to view Robin Wood, despite this posture of slackness or this posture of seeming lack of agency, as one that's full of a great deal of agency, almost too much agency. In fact, agency of a kind and a quantity which other human beings will utterly fail to even perceive and obviously to contain. So, how does that happen? It happens through the use of images and metaphors from the world of nature. So, the first is the perfume exhaled by the body is that of the earth, flesh, fungi, and which smells of captured dampness and yet dryness. So, there is this, so the earth is breathing through this body of this prone woman. That's the first thing. Then there is also an inner malady of the sea, which makes it seem as if she has invaded a sleep, incautious and entire. So several things are happening. The sea, unlike the earth, does not give Robin Wood its smell, but rather manifests itself as an inner malady. Now, an inner malady, malady means a sort of sickness or some form of unhealthiness or a lack of health. And here, malady is used in a metaphorical sense because for a lot of people, strangeness or the inability to fit into expected and established gender roles, which happens to a lot of individuals who happen to be queer and who identify as queer. Queerness was often seen and is also often seen even today in many parts of the world as a kind of departure from normalcy. And there are often attempts to cure queerness or to fix same-sex affinities in many individuals. And these are very horrific, very painful, very violent stories. But nonetheless, these events and these actions do take place. So the sea here is an inner malady, and it makes the figure of Robin Wood seem as if she has invaded a sleep, incautious and entire. Incautious and entire, alliterative phrases, they describe both the world of dreams, which is a world in which the usual moralities, the usual restrictions, the usual hierarchies of waking life or normal society are suspended. This is one way in which the world of sleep or sleeping helps an individual enter a world in which the usual restrictions don't apply. But here we are also given this other word, which is incautious and entire. So even the act of sleeping, which normally opens up forbidden roles or restricted roles, there is something incautious in the way that this person, Robin Wood, seems to have invaded the world of sleep. And incautious is also coupled with the word entire. So what does it mean to sleep entirely? It's a strange expression. One way in which the word entire can qualify the word sleep is by describing the extent to which Robin Wood was willing to go forward in this world where the usual morality or the usual restrictions did not apply. So an entire and incautious sleep could mean a complete and utter rejection of the restrictions that define modern life. And then we get more examples that her flesh had the texture of plant life, and we get a very intricate description of the frame, right? Now, a frame could be either the branches of a tree, it could be the single powerful central branch, the stem of a tree. It could also refer to bones or the skeletal frame of a human body. And we are told something about the kind of frame that one can perceive beneath this plant-like flesh of Robin Wood. And what is this frame like? It is broad, it is porous, and it is sleep-worn. Right? So it has been affected by a lot of sleep. So a stationary thing almost. Just like plants are stationary, and the quality of being stationary is often described in a negative way with adjectives like vegetal state or vegetate almost. And there's a very powerful contemporary feminist interpretation of this very idea in several books now, but I think one that comes to mind is the South Korean writer Han Kang's The Vegetarian. So there are powerful reinterpretations of the agency that lies inherent in the bodies and the texture of plants. And a lot of creative writers have been coming up with creative ways of appropriating some of that radical, subversive energy in interhuman, interpersonal interactions as well. So we can see again how this novel from 1936 very powerfully anticipates those intellectual developments as well. But to return to the sentence, sleep is something that has affected Robin's frame, but also there is a decay fishing for Robin beneath the visible surface. So there is a sort of decay which is associated with sleep. It is a sort of decomposition and the usual physiological explanation of why being stationary is bad. And this is the kind of explanation one would get if one talks to a medical health professional, is that lack of motion means or leads to the muscles being decomposed, or if muscles are not frequently expanded and contracted, then they decay. This is a negative definition of how being stationary, being vegetal, can produce decay or a decomposition. But here we see the writer retrieving decay and taking the word decay with its association with the stationary and vegetal state of plants and reinventing it, or at least infusing it with a sense of agency and hope. So there is a decay that's fishing for Robin beneath the visible surface of her plant-textured skin. It's a very strange and very cryptic image, and I will only offer one suggestion, which is that sleep is a way of both escaping temporarily the restrictions of modern world, but sleep also has the possibility of opening up an alternative world in which it's possible not just to escape the restrictive modern world, but also to resist, challenge that world, and possibly create another more egalitarian world. Now, what do Felix and the doctor do when they see this figure, this very, very complex figure? So Felix begins to do something which I will read now. In the narrator's words, Felix now saw the doctor partially hidden by the screen beside the bed, make the movements common to the dumbfounder or man of magic, the gestures of one who, in preparing the audience for a miracle, must pretend that there's nothing to hide. The whole purpose that of making the back and the elbows move in a series of honesties, while in reality the most flagrant part of the hoax is being prepared. So the doctor pretends to give an appearance that what he's about to do is perfectly normal. But Felix suspects that the doctor is going to do something which is not normal. And what does the doctor do? He draws a line of rouge across his lips and covers with his hand a loose 100-franc note lying on the table. So this is something that establishes the relationship between these two individuals. Felix sees the doctor wear makeup and commit theft, that is, steal money. And instead of turning Felix against the doctor, these actions which Felix witnesses have the opposite effect. And this is how the narrator puts it. He knew, that is, Felix knew, that he would continue to like the doctor, though he was aware that it would be in spite of a long series of convulsions of the spirit, analogous to the displacement in the fluids of the oyster that must cover its itch with a pearl. So he would have to cover the doctor. He knew at the same time that this stricture of acceptance would eventually be a part of himself, though originally brought on by no will of its own. So in a way, this action binds these two individuals. And in the justification that Felix has to provide in his own imagination about the kind of actions that the doctor commits, is described again with a very, very intricate image from the natural world, which is the displacement in the fluids of the oyster that must cover its itch with a pearl. So just as pearls are created in an oyster, similarly, and the pearl is the residue, it is the remnant of a process, of a biochemical process, of the evolution of life. And this process is described again very creatively by the narrator as the covering of an itch. So, a sort of coping mechanism, a mechanism which is inherently uncomfortable, perhaps violent, maybe unsafe, but is definitely not a good experience. But this results in a pearl. So, the pearl, whose outward beauty is famed all over the world, it's also very expensive, it's worn as a jewel, etc., etc. The image here that the narrator provides is that of the difficulty, the long drawn process of convoluted process of discomfort, maybe violence, maybe even pain, which results in something whose external and outward appearance is one of dazzling and shimmering beauty. So, similarly, this would be analogous to the kind of affection or affinity that Felix would have for the doctor. So, effectively, Felix would find it very difficult to accept, to condone the doctor's actions, but he would also try to convince himself that they were acceptable. And this process would produce, in between the two, a relationship which would be the interpersonal equivalent of the pearl in an oyster. And further, the narrator also tells us that this would mirror, in an analogous way, Felix's relationship, Felix's mode of acceptance of what he himself is. Right? And that identity is not very easy for Felix to accept, but he will eventually find a way to accept it. Now, one final important image, which I will end with, is that of an animal which the narrator references in the description of Robin. I will end with that description and continue to describe it and provide some context in the next lecture. The key phrase is that of a beast turning human. Now, this phrase is very important because it helps us to understand a great deal of the kinds of energies, psychological, historical, that the novel is tracing, and between which the individuals that we meet are struggling to make an existence. So, this expression is used in the way that Felix and the doctor notice Robin. The narrator writes, Felix, who had been looking into them, that is Robin's eyes, intently because of the mysterious and shocking blue, found himself seeing them still faintly clear and timeless behind the lids, the long unqualified range in the iris of wild beasts who have not tamed the focus down to meet the human eye. So there's something in the way that Robin's face, Robin's appearance is encountered by Felix and the doctor, and that is described as something that one finds in the iris of wild beasts who have not tamed the focus down to meet the human eye. So there is an animalistic expression in the eyes of Robin Wood. What does this mean? Let us read the whole passage and then I will try to gloss it. The narrator describes, the woman who presents herself to the spectator as a picture forever arranged is, for the contemplative mind, the chiefest danger. Sometimes one meets a woman who is beast turning human. Such a person's every movement will reduce to an image of a forgotten experience, a mirage of an eternal wedding cast on the racial memory. As insupportable a joy as would be the vision of an eland coming down an aisle of trees, chapleted with orange blossoms and bridal veil. A hoof raised in the economy of fear, stepping in the trepidation of flesh that will become myth. As the unicorn is neither man nor beast deprived, but human hunger pressing its breast to its prey. So this sentence, in these last two sentences, they combine so many metaphors and so many images that it's very difficult to exactly gloss very quickly what they mean. So whoever is watching this, I urge you all to sit down and read these sentences a few times and if possible to diagram them. Diagramming a sentence is often a skill that's taught to middle school or high school students in lessons of English grammar, and it's usually not practiced when reading literature like novels. However, the way language is used in this novel, Nightwood, it would really reward this diagramming sentence activity. And the combination of such a wide range of metaphors, subjects, objects, subclauses in these sentences mean that diagramming this sentence will help clarify a lot of the stakes in this thought. The first is that there is something alien, something strange, something that's not what is humanly expected that is found in Robin's eyes. That is first. And second, we get a description of the kind of beast that is turning human. There is this interface between human and animal, but it is an interface which blurs the ontological separation between these two forms of life. So, most encounters between human beings and animals assume and require for their moral and intellectual significance to be unpacked, for they require that the ontological differences be preserved. Animals are animals and humans are humans. There are some essential, basic, non-negotiable differences between these two categories of existence, and only if these essential differences exist can the traditional mythical stories have their meaning. Now, in this case, the narrator is invoking those myths, those mythical stories, but the narrator is blurring the boundaries between these categories of existence. And one hint about what kind of beast it is, we get this image of the unicorn whose hooves are raised in the economy of fear, and it is neither beast nor man, but it is an expression of a hunger which is quite human in its origins. What does all this mean? I will gloss this image and also provide a reference to the history of unicorns in Christian myth as well as popular culture in the next lecture. Thank you.